cambiar vidas,
change lives,
change organizations,
change
दुनिया में
organizations,
बदलाव.
Change the world.
The Cleantech Open, which is the organization I now run, is the world's largest clean tech accelerator. And that sounds pretty highfalutin. It sounds like we're a very large organization, and in some regards we are. But it's an indication of the state of the union as to the fact that the Cleantech Open, the world's largest clean tech accelerator working with very early stage companies, is actually a very small organization. It's run by a very small group of core staff here in Silicon Valley. But as you can see, as you'll find out when I start to explain some of the things we do, we have a very large group of volunteers who make this thing both a national and an international organization. The Cleantech Open now operates in 26 countries worldwide, and I'll give you a little bit of that story as we go along. But before we do that, I'm going to do a little bit of scene setting, if you'll allow me to. I've just come back. In fact, it's been a very, very busy few weeks for me. I've just come back from something that some of you may have heard of, which is called Rio Plus 20. Does this ring any bells? Anyone heard of Rio Plus 20? Yes. So Rio Plus 20 was an Earth Summit, is an Earth Summit. It's taking place right now in Rio de Janeiro, and it is 20 years on from the first Rio Summit, which took place in 1992. And it really helps us set the scene in a number of different ways. And most of those ways are not very positive, unfortunately. The environment that we exist in right now is one in which, particularly in the US, we do not have the policy infrastructures we were just discussing a second ago. The government has placed some bets. Has the word Solyndra been used at all over the past few days? I suspect it has. Yeah, it's the four-letter. We call it the S word now. The government's placed some bets in the clean energy space, which have not paid off, or at least the one that has not paid off in a spectacular fashion has, in a public sense, outweighed those that are beginning to take off that are much quieter. We have a situation where policy momentum has subsided in the US, where even the Europeans are pulling back to a degree. The feed-in tariff in Germany has been ratcheted back and so forth. I've heard the conversation beginning to take place about fracking and natural gas here in the US, which, depending where you sit, is good news for cleaner energy, but probably pushing the agenda for truly renewable energy back. And many of the companies, the very early stage companies that we work with, are certainly seeing the reduction in price in natural gas as being a big issue. It was only in 2003 that Alan Greenspan, who was head of the Fed in the US, was warning us that we weren't going to have enough natural gas to meet demand. It's remarkable how things have changed. He was saying that we were going to have to import a lot more natural gas and that we were going to have to build some more LNG terminals and so forth. So you will see a little bit more about Brazil here. This is me holding forth on a panel on entrepreneurship. You'll see that there are members of the panel falling asleep next to me as I'm talking. And the whole situation about Rio is something which, which really kind of, I think, does set the scene from a kind of big perspective. In the 1992 conference, there were 109 countries represented and 172 heads of state turned up. George H.W. Bush turned up, and the Dalai Lama was there, and more importantly, Jane Fonda was there. And we had a very big treaty which was signed called the Convention on Climate Change, which led to the Kyoto Protocol. And it took 15 days, just 15 days, for that agreement to be reached with all these very high-profile heads of government. In the Rio Plus 20 convention, which is taking place right now and where I was at a little while ago, there is no framework convention on the table. They're not even discussing that. What they are discussing, however, is a series of what many people see as kind of minor, piecemeal topics. And for those of us in the entrepreneurial space, we don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of those issues. One of the big topics that has been raised is something called Sustainable Energy for All. I think I've got a slide on it. Here it is. 2012 is the International Year of Sustainable Energy for All. Anyone heard of this? Has anyone heard of this at all in the room? The International Year of Sustainable Energy for All. It's a very big global initiative, and the surprising thing is almost no one's heard of it. It's a United Nations initiative. The Secretary General of the UN has announced this, and there are kind of three areas that they're looking at, which are, one, to ensure universal access to modern energy services, secondly, to double the global rate of improvement of energy efficiency. I hope you're happy about that one, because it's a good piece of news, and thirdly, to double the share of renewable energy in the global energy mix. So there are 1.3 billion people right now who do not have access to energy in the world. That is 1 in 5 of the world's population, and nearly 40% of the world's population relies on wood or charcoal or animal dung to cook their food, and about 2 million of them die each year as a result of that, mainly women and children. So it's a big issue, and you'll see the relevance to entrepreneurship in a second. The second of the key objectives of Sustainable Energy for All is to double the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency. So it is well known that there's plenty of energy efficiency technology available today which could be deployed. If we were to deploy what we know today, we could reduce the global demand for energy by about 14%, just using what we know today. And that's the second big objective. Right now, renewable energy accounts for about 15% of the mix, which is a big increase over a few years ago of energy production. The goal by 2030 is to double that to 30%. And the interesting thing about all of this is that because there is no major framework agreement, because governments aren't really delivering, because everybody is much more concerned about economic issues today than they are about environmental issues, where are they looking to find these solutions? Well, bizarrely and surprisingly and wonderfully, they're looking to the entrepreneur. So a major part of the focus in Rio right now is looking to innovators and entrepreneurs to find the solutions to these big challenges. Is that a big cop-out? Do we use the word cop-out in Taiwan? Probably not. Is that the governments of the world not taking the responsibility they should for these big issues? Yes, it is, in my opinion. It's a way of offloading the burden to other people, because we need the policy framework, we need the framework agreements, and we need entrepreneurs who are going to deliver these kinds of technologies. In the US, interestingly, entrepreneurs are already providing a lot of the answers to the solutions. The big utilities in the United States do not have R&D departments. PG&E, which is the utility that's providing the electrons that are powering these lights today, doesn't have an R&D department. They don't do their own research and development. They look to third parties to find those solutions for them. Dow Chemical and Chevron and many other companies that we work with, major corporations, are making big strides in this space, and they are constantly looking for innovators and entrepreneurs to deliver the next generation. Thomas Friedman, anyone here heard of Thomas Friedman? Thomas Friedman is a journalist and author. He wrote a book called Hot, Flat, and Crowded. He says what we need is 100,000 innovators in their garages looking for these kinds of solutions. The solutions will probably not come from the big companies. They'll come from the little guy who is finding ways to make these things work. So the entrepreneur has a very big role to play, even in an official sense. In many ways, the kind of grassroots activities coming up are one of those things that almost happened by accident, but it's become the case that the governments of the world recognize that entrepreneurship is a key part of the mix for environmental and economic reasons. So what about the economic reasons? Well, all the net jobs in the United States economy, all the net new jobs come from little companies growing big. Big companies get a little bit, on average, overall, get a little bit bigger and a little bit smaller and so forth. Some of them die, some of them increase capacity and so forth. But overall, the big companies do not add new jobs to the economy. It is the case that all the net new jobs come from the little guy who is growing big. And there are lots of statistics which are kind of interesting about how this whole thing works. in fact, if you look at the way that the biggest companies in America fit right now, of the 25 largest companies in America in 1998, 8 of them didn't exist at all in 1960. So these are companies that have grown from small, the Ciscos, the Apples, the Intels of this world. They're called high-growth startups. We're not talking about hairdressers and other retailers. We're talking about companies in the technology space in one shape or form. And the trend continues. It took 20 years to replace 1/3 of the Fortune 500, the 500 biggest companies in America, over the period from 1940 to 1960, but only 4 years to replace that number in the period after 1998. So we're accelerating the trend to small companies growing big and providing a major part of the economy. Okay. When we hit the recession, the Wall Street Journal said the only way the American economy is going to regain its lost health and vitality is to lead the world into the future. Entrepreneurs are the only people who can get us there. So there is a mix of issues here. There's the environmental issue, there's the economic issue, there's the how do we solve these big energy problems issue. Can the entrepreneur really be the solution to all of these? Well, unfortunately, I will say the answer is no. We certainly need more of a policy umbrella and so forth. But there are lots of things we can do, and I'm going to go through some of the steps that we believe it takes to make a successful entrepreneur. One of them is to understand how these companies get funded. Another is to make sure that there is an understanding in the entrepreneurial community that there's a difference between a small clean tech startup and a small Web 2.0 startup. There are lots and lots of differences. These companies tend to be very capital intensive. They tend to grow much more slowly. They're the kinds of companies you can't start in a back bedroom somewhere with a couple of college kids and a server. These, in many cases, are companies which are going to have to take on major incumbents, the big companies who are in the space already. So there are many challenges for an early-stage energy or clean technology entrepreneur to face. And one of the ways that we help them resolve those challenges is by working with them to introduce them to those major incumbents. So I've mentioned already that PG&E and other utilities in the US do not have an R&D department. What can we do to make sure those companies get fed into the mix? Well, one of the things we can do is explain to them what it takes for a very early stage company to think about the things they wouldn't normally think about. Because what do entrepreneurs want to do? They want to kind of get on with developing. They want to get their product out into the market without ever really properly testing the ways they'll do that and so forth. And yet there are things you have to think about very early on. For instance, if you are developing a solution which you will sell using utility as your channel, then you have to achieve some level of certification. In the US, there are major organizations that do this. There's a certification organization called UL. They test certain technologies to make sure that they meet their standards. There's the AHRA, which is the American Heating and Air Conditioning and Refrigeration Association, and they have a certification standard. And what often happens is that many early-stage companies don't recognize the work that's required at the initial design phase to ensure that certification can take place. So 3 years later, they go and see a utility, and they say, I've got this magnificent technology. I'd love you to distribute this thing for me. And the utility will say, well, hang on a second. What's the certification process? And they've got to unpick a huge amount of work that they could have designed in better. So there are some very specific elements of help that we need to give early stage companies. Another channel, another conduit for early stage companies are the so-called ESCOs, the energy service companies. And they tend to be in the pockets of very big companies like Chevron. So Chevron has an ESCO based here in San Francisco. And what the Chevron ESCO does is they sell services to major corporations. They may well sell services to an organization like Stanford. And they're an energy efficiency organization, so they'll put in LED lighting, and they'll put in a more efficient air conditioning solution and so forth. And they won't ask Stanford to pay for it up front. They'll cover the upfront costs, and they will share the upside. So in other words, an organization the size of Stanford could have a contract with an ESCO, and the ESCO will cover the initial capital costs, and they'll both get the benefit of the energy efficiency improvement. Again, many of the companies that we work with want to work with ESCOs. They expect that the ESCO will be their channel, but they haven't baked in to the early stage of their design. They haven't had the conversation about the kind of mix. They haven't had the conversation about what's acceptable in terms of deployment and implementation costs. So part of our role is to get this kind of knowledge, very specific knowledge, into the hands of early stage companies. Alrighty. So what can we talk about in terms of the US and the economy that we're in today, and entrepreneurship and the environment? Now, it is true to say, I think most people would say that, that China has won in the first inning of this race to be the leader in clean technologies. And there are lots of pieces of evidence of that. There's been less venture capital spent in China, but more IPOs. The Chinese government has a much less regulation-intensive environment, and you were just giving an example a minute ago to me about a scenario where big companies will go into China and test. Many of the companies that we work with, big and small, are using China as their test bed. The Chinese government, in some cases, will give people a huge amount of lab space to take their technology and prove it out, pilot technologies and so forth. So China has very much taken the lead in this space. But entrepreneurship, as I'm positing, is the answer to many of these issues. And you will see here that the US is right up to the top right of this chart. And the chart basically says that the economies that support entrepreneurship are the economies that do best. That's the simple solution. And there are a few other kind of points on this chart. You'll see that China is quite a long way down. I mean, they're doing fine, but they're not right at the top there. So one of the things about the United States, and one of the reasons the US has survived in an environment where things don't look too rosy for the clean tech entrepreneur, is because of this environment. We have an environment which supports entrepreneurship. The economic fundamentals reflect that. Even more so in the US, there's a little part of it, it's called Silicon Valley, which has a disproportionate role to play in innovation and entrepreneurship. This chart basically says that we've actually got sustained GDP growth in the US, but there's been erratic job growth over the past few years. It's been going up and down over the past few years, and this is the the general trend. You'll see that the blue bar, which is US GDP, although it's not been growing as consistently as our president would like, has nevertheless, we have been adding to the GDP line. Jobs, well, they go up and down. We've been adding some jobs and shedding some jobs quarter by quarter. That picture's not particularly rosy. But in Silicon Valley, interestingly, we're back to 97% of the pre-recession peak. So there were a very large number of jobs in this area. We're almost back to where we started. There's been a dip in Silicon Valley. And of course, Silicon Valley is founded on, sorry, am I standing right in your way? Silicon Valley, of course, is founded on the whole principle of entrepreneurship. These are some statistics from the Cleantech Open's own findings about the companies that we work with. And I'm going to show you a map of our world in a second or two so you can see the areas that our entrepreneurs come from. But you're going to see that 2/3 of all the money raised that Marguerite mentioned, it's now about $700 million has been raised by US companies alone who've been through our process. 2/3 of that money has been raised in California, which really means Silicon Valley. And if you put all the rest of the world together, only about 1/3 of the total has been raised outside the US. And the same thing applies to the patents that have been issued. So nearly 2/3 of all the patents that have been issued to Cleantech Open companies have been issued to companies who are based in California, and they are by no means 2/3 of the total number of companies. In fact, it's true to say that in the US alone, about half the companies every year have typically come from California. That percentage is falling slightly, but the proportion of the money raised and the proportion of the patents issued really very much come here. And there's some very special things about Silicon Valley. I'm sure you've heard some of them and met some of the reasons over the past few days. So let me go on to talk now a little bit about the Cleantech Open and what we do, because this story here is not about promoting the Cleantech Open. It's about promoting the cause of entrepreneurship and explaining the steps that we take a company through. As you will understand, we're looking very much for partners in other parts of the world who would like to take entrepreneurship and take Cleantech entrepreneurship and apply this overlay that we've been working on. So the Cleantech Open is the world's largest Cleantech accelerator, as I mentioned. We have about 2,000 volunteers in the US now, and we have 7 regional organizations running Cleantech Opens. We ran about 100 events in 26 countries last year, and we've awarded about $5 million in prizes, which is about half cash and half services. So when a company goes through this process, they get an opportunity to take on services from marketing companies and legal services firms and other people who can, PR companies, the kinds of things you need when you're a very early stage company and you expect to grow big. So we give them access to those kinds of things. There have been 581 companies, nearly 600 companies who've raised $660 million. We also work with NASA now. So we're taking Cleantech to the moon, and we are running a challenge on their behalf over the next 18 months, which is for a night rover, which will exist for the full 14 days of a lunar night. In other words, if you're on any point of the moon and you don't move, there are 14 days worth of night that you have to operate in. And the lunar rover they're looking for is going to need to have enough battery power and solar cells on it to keep operating through those 14 days. A terrific challenge that's never been solved yet. And guess what? NASA is looking to entrepreneurs to solve that problem. They're not spending vast sums of money. They know it would cost a fortune to do this inside NASA. So they're giving $1.5 million via the Cleantech Open to entrepreneurs to solve this challenge, which is incredibly cheap for them to solve a major intractable problem. So what it is about entrepreneurship and about the kinds of things that we do that really matter. This fella, this very handsome fella here is called Andy Hargaden. He is a professor of entrepreneurship at UC Davis, someone in the University of California system. And he says, interestingly, that ideas do not matter. Good ideas languish all the time. What matters, execution. It's a very big word, by the way, this execution thing. What does it mean? We have some ideas about what it means. It's everything, he says, especially, ironically enough, with breakthrough technologies. And what he's pointing out is that many scientists with nifty ideas, very strong ideas about how to deliver a terrific new solution in renewable energy and transportation and so on and so forth, believe that because their thing is 27% more efficient than the alternatives, that everyone will come and buy this thing. And unfortunately, that is simply not true. There are lots of reasons why it doesn't happen. A major reason is that there are often big companies in the spaces that we're working in, and they eat the lunch of little guys. And there are plenty more issues that we have to address to take a small company and grow them big. And for the most part, the best technologies, sadly, do not win. Most of these companies, even ones with outstanding technologies, fail. The Cleantech Open's mandate, therefore, the reason that we exist is to help the companies that we work with reduce their propensity to fail. How do we find a way to take a company that would probably fail, that has a nifty idea, that could maybe change the global energy mix, that could meet some of the things that Ban Ki-moon is interested in at the UN, could help improve our energy efficiency, that could help improve our energy mix, that could help solve the problem of people dying because of the wrong kinds of fuel they're using to cook their meals on. How can we increase their propensity to succeed? And that's everything that I'm now going to talk about, really, is I'm going to talk about ways in which we look to the entrepreneur and how we go about in, making sure that they have a chance of success. We can't guarantee success, we can improve their chances. So the Cleantech Open is all about delivering a reliable, repeatable process that increases the chances of making a clean tech startup successful. We are deconstructing, if you like, pulling apart the elements of entrepreneurship. Our entrepreneurs progressively de-risk. It's a horrible word. I'm told it's illegal to use this word in august halls of Stanford, but nevertheless, it's a word that the investors use a lot, to de-risk, take the risk out of an enterprise, a small business, with the aim of making it more attractive to prospective investors and customers. And we work with companies in 6 different areas, mainly energy related, so energy generation, energy distribution, energy efficiency, also in transportation, air, water, and waste. And this area we call smart power, which is battery storage and the like. And finally, the area called green building, which is methodologies for building better buildings that are more energy efficient typically, and also for running them in a more efficient fashion. So we take the companies that we work with through a process. It starts with something called the Cleantech Open Academy. We've just run our academy, our big national academy, over this past weekend. Part of the reason I've been a bit of a busy boy in recent history is the Cleantech Open Academy took place. We then take them through a 10-week process. And I want to explain that 10-week process to you very quickly because it's going to give you a feel for the sort of things that we do with these companies. We take companies and introduce them to something called the business model canvas, which means that, in essence, we do not ask them to write business plans. Business plans are for big companies that already know what they're doing. Most small companies, perhaps all small companies, have no idea what they're doing, how they're going to get the product into the market. Why? Because they're small. If they had figured those things out, they'd be big. So by definition, we're asking them to do things to get their business off the ground. So one of the major things we do with early stage entrepreneurs is we say, get out of the building. There's a fellow called Steve Blank who lectures at Berkeley and at Stanford, and this is very much his philosophy of entrepreneurship. Get out of the building. Go talk to real people who are in your market. Not me, not Marguerite, but the guy who buys coatings for this particular product. Go talk to that person and say, I have this new coating. It's 27% more efficient than the alternatives. Would you buy it? And if the fellow says, no, I wouldn't, then find out why. And if he says, yes, I would, then find out why. So it's all about talking to real people in the real market and finding out the attributes of the kinds of things they would buy. Another major thing is called technology validation. That's product validation. Technology validation means having a conversation with professors at Stanford, having a conversation with UL or one of the certification agencies and saying, could you certify that this thing, when it's finished, will work? Could you make sure that it's clear it doesn't break the laws of physics and the like? So why is this important? Well, little companies don't sell their products to big companies if there's a lack of comfort about it. So we have to go through a technology validation process. We have to de-risk, take the risk out of this thing so that potential customers and potential investors feel good about investing or buying this thing. And on we go. We then talk them through something called go-to-market strategy. How do we take a product from the lab into the real market? We teach them about financial analysis and modeling. Simple example of this is something called benchmarking. Many of the entrepreneurs that come to us give us a financial projection, which, by the way, is always fiction. When someone gives you a financial projection, they're talking about the future, and they are always fiction by definition. They are made-up stories. But if you give me a financial projection and I'm a venture capitalist and I look at it and it's not credible, then you're not credible. You've already given me something which says you don't know what you're doing. So how do we enhance credibility? Well, we do something called benchmarking. If the projection that comes to me shows that you're going to have more revenue than Google within 3 years, by the way, this is a very common thing that happens, then it's probably not credible. We probably aren't going to believe that. If you come to me and you say, I'm going to make a 93% gross margin, in other words, if I take away my costs, my cost of sales from my revenue on my products, and I'm going to make a 93% margin on that, 93% profit on every unit I sell, and everybody else in the industry makes a 12% gross margin, then at the very least I need to justify that. So benchmarking is a methodology for explaining to entrepreneurs, you need to be credible, you need to take the elements of your business and deliver them in a fashion which makes sense. And on we go, and we go through helping these companies protect their intellectual property, their IP. We take them through the best kinds of structures for a clean tech company. We take them through building a team. Now, building a team is crucially important to early stage companies. And having a team doesn't mean having a VP of sales and having a CEO and having a CTO. It means having precisely the right person, somebody who has specifically solved this problem before. So finding exactly the right guy or gal for the job is a major part of the work we take these companies through. Once we've completed the academy and the 10 weeks worth of training, we then put them through a judging process. And the Cleantech Open Accelerator really isn't very much about the competition, but there is a competition that goes along with this. So we want to pick the best companies, and we want to give them some money. We want to signal to the world that these are the best companies. So we put them through a regional awards process. If any of you have ever seen an American television show called American Idol, it's a bit like that. We're not teaching them to sing in this particular case. We're teaching them to turn out a terrific business. We get them in front of the press, and then we do something right at the end of the year. We put them up on a big stage at the Global Forum right here in Silicon Valley, and we run the Academy Awards of Clean Tech. The Global Forum, we had 23 countries participate in this last year. Why do we do this? Well, a major reason is because we believe, in fact, it's very much evident, that if Steve Jobs had worked for a very small company in some far-flung corner of the globe, and the company were called Kawanga, would he have made the success that he's made of the iPad and the iPod and the iPhone and so forth? We think not. A lot of this is about getting these companies to the stage where people have heard of them. The guy with the 27% more efficient solution is going to do a lot better if people have heard about it. So we get them on stage. We ask them to create some notoriety for themselves. This is too detailed a slide for me to go in great detail with you, and I don't intend that, but I just want to give you some of the kinds of things that we are looking for, the kinds of things that a clean tech venture capitalist is looking for. They're looking for companies that will sell. They're looking for companies that will go through to IPO. More often than not, these companies will sell to a major company in the space. They're also looking for something we call milestone products. So if a company comes to us and says, I need $20 million, and if I can have $20 million, then I can solve the world's problems in green building, in renewable energy, and so forth, we're very likely to say, that's a terrific story. Unfortunately, you're very unlikely to raise $20 million. There are lots and lots of companies that need $20 million right now to prove that they can solve a major problem. So what we do is we encourage them to do milestone products, little versions of their product on the way. Can you come out with 10% of the main product or 3% of the main product and sell it for something to somebody? And then we take them through step by step building the full solution. Worksheets and investor documents are all part of the process I've mentioned. So here is our footprint. This is what the Cleantech Open looks like in the US. Back in 2006, the Cleantech Open was very much in this corner of California, in Silicon Valley. It was called the California Cleantech Open. And it was a relatively informal process at the time, but did very, very well. And we have grown over the years to cover not every piece of the US. There's an area there called the Midwest, which is not yet covered. There are some people in Florida who don't yet have a local Cleantech Open to work with. But overall, the Cleantech Open, because of this very repeatable, scalable process, this way of taking an early-stage entrepreneur and helping them turn an idea into a successful business, has gradually moved eastwards. And we've covered the country with these kinds of services and help. And as I mentioned, the Cleantech Open now operates in many countries throughout the earth. We had 23 countries participating in this last year. We do not do everything in those countries we do here in the US. So we've taken a small sliver of the Cleantech Open that exists here, and we've put it in various places. The Australian government runs a version of this. It's a very high-profile thing in Australia. Last year in South Africa, we put on something in conjunction with the climate talks in Durban. We had a big awards gala there. Some terrific companies came out of that, and so forth. But overall, we're taking little pieces of this and delivering it. Our goal is to take the Cleantech Open as it exists, the full process and the full accelerator, and help particularly developing countries, but also other parts of the world. Taiwan would be one of those that we're very strongly targeting to take this process and help encourage the cleantech entrepreneur. I'm going to finish up with some example success stories. Some of the companies who fit into the question that you're raising today about smart cities. And I've chosen these particular companies because I thought they might be useful examples for the kinds of things that you can see that entrepreneurs are doing to solve some of these major energy, environmental, and economic challenges. It starts with a slightly unusual one, but I'll go there first, a company called EarthClean. Now, EarthClean has a fire suppressant. And it's interesting because if you set a building on fire, which they occasionally do, they run pilot fires to test different suppressants and so forth. If you set a building on fire and ask the local fire chief to come along and estimate how many gallons of water it'll take to put the fire out, he'll come up with a number. And what the founder of EarthClean does is say, okay, well, we're going to mix in our product, which produces a gel with water, and we'll put the fire out. And what they repeatedly prove is that you can put the fire out with their stuff mixed into the water with about 8% of the total water required, much less water. So it's saving a lot of water, which is one of the big challenges we have on the planet right now. It's an interesting story. It's kind of tangential to a smarter city, but it's certainly one of the ways that cities could be improving their environmental footprint. One of the reasons I raise it, however, is because the fellow who runs this company, Doug Ruth, stood up on stage at the Academy Awards of Cleantech, the global awards, in 2009, and he explained all this and explained about his business model to people, and they all thought it was very cool, and he's kind of a funny guy, and they enjoyed it. At the end of it, he drank the fire suppressant, the fire retardant. And in all these years since that happened, the one company that people mention to me more than anything else is Doug Ruth and his fire suppressant. It just goes to show one silly little gimmick. He drank it to show it wasn't toxic, right? That what gets left behind can be left in the ground and it can naturally degrade. Well, what's interesting about it is that a year after he presented, there were some wildfires in Texas. Someone in the audience that day happened to phone him up and say, look, I saw your presentation. It stood out to me. I've been phoning the guy who's trying to get the wildfires out in Texas. Could you send some EarthClean, some of this Tetra KO, which he has, down to Texas, please? And he did, and they used it on the wildfires. He's now raised a lot of money, and he's doing very well. But it started with a gimmick, right? It started with something very simple. So in entrepreneurship, much of this is not about the dry facts. It's about how you get this product above the parapet into people's consciousness. Purelytics. It was the winner of the Cleantech Open Grand Prize in 2009, and they have a water filtration product which can go at a municipal scale, it can go at a residential scale, and it can also go into a plastic bag and be used in the developing countries. It uses light. It's a 5-stage process. It uses light to filter water. Water being one of those big issues, one of these very important things. 5 stages, there's no toxic residue left at the end. You're not using chemicals. You're using light and a series of membranes to do the water filtration. Nela. Now, they're interesting for a slightly different reason. Now, Nela is a company based in Los Angeles, California. And it's kind of a fun story, which I think is slightly tangential to the point, but I want to raise it for you anyway. Nela is founded by a fellow called Jim Sanfilippo. That's him in the picture wearing the sunglasses there. And he came up with an LED array. So LEDs, very much the thing now for energy efficiency. CFLs, or fluorescent bulbs, were a kind of interim step. But now we're using LEDs more and more in this space. And he came up with an LED array which had some very specific characteristics. He worked in the movie industry in Hollywood, and he recognized that the kinds of lights, these big tungsten lights, which is technology which has been around for well over 100 years, get very hot and they shatter occasionally. And when they shatter, they fall on the actors beneath them, and they cause a fair amount of discomfort, as you can imagine. And they fail about once every 100 hours. The mean time between failure is about 100 hours. So they fail pretty regularly. So they're hot and they're unreliable. Well, could we have an LED array that solves that problem? And he invented something. There are some issues with LEDs in terms of color temperature, the kinds of colors you get. And he fixed those problems. And his view is that if all the movie studios in Hollywood were to use Nelas instead of conventional lights, you could decommission 2 entire power plants. And there are plenty of similar examples of things you could do that move things forward that could take the requirement down for energy very dramatically. By the way, his lights are also starting to be used in street lighting applications and so forth. The US Congress uses his lighting now because they are bright and very cool. You can touch the thing. Greenvolts is a company that has the only fully integrated solar system. They've raised about $130 million. They went through the very first Cleantech Open back in 2006. They had for a little while what was the world's largest solar farm, a very small company, growing big. They met PG&E through the Cleantech Open process, and PG&E commissioned them to build a solar farm, and now they're building solar farms for many countries, for many cities around the country. Synchromatics went through the 2007 Cleantech Open. They have a technology which you've seen elsewhere, but they've just taken it to a next level. They have a technology for tracking buses using GPS. Now, interestingly, they've got plenty of incumbent competition. There are plenty of companies who have the ability to tell you when the next bus is coming. In Taiwan, you probably have signs up saying next bus due in 3 minutes. Certainly in London they do, and many other cities around the world you have this kind of thing. So this will do that, but it'll also let you know. It'll also let you know when a bus is coming on your cell phone, and you can look it up on your browser, of course, at home. It also provides information to the fleet operator, so they can reduce the number of buses they need to have. They can increase the efficiency of their bus fleet. There are other companies doing this kind of thing. Here's a company using the latest technologies, and they are constantly innovating. Up here, you can probably see that it shows that the bus is 20% full, so there is room for me if I get on it. It's stopped right now. Here are the stops that are coming up, and the door is open at the moment. So you can get a lot of detailed information, and you can time your arrival at the bus stop. And finally, Biofiltro, which was the winner of the Global Cleantech Open last year, a company from Chile. Now, Biofiltro, I have to say, when I saw their presentation, I thought they didn't stand any chance of getting all the way through to win the competition. But I understand now why they did, because if you look into what they have, it's really very interesting, and they are making a lot of money at doing it. So Biofiltro uses worms to eat human waste. And they have developed an environment where you can build a municipal sewage plant based on worms eating the waste, and they poop out something which is organic as a result of this process. It costs about the same or a little bit less for a small city. So a small town the size of Palo Alto could implement one of these things for a few $100,000. They'd spend about the same as a traditional sewage plant, but there is no toxic residue as a result. These worms, in other words, solve a major problem with disposing of that kind of waste. A terrific thing, because it's $100,000 or a few $100,000 a pop for one of these things. This is a big business very fast, cost competitive, organic, clean, and a next generation smarter cities technology. Here are some of the companies that we've taken through the process and some of the funding they've achieved recently. About 40% of the reporting companies have now raised venture capital in some way, shape, or form. So we feel very comfortable that the process we're taking them through works. Only about 1% of the companies that apply to a venture capitalist typically get funded, so their propensity is increasing. And just finally, just to finish up, I'm just going to mention one very obvious point, which is there is a big environmental mandate. The oceans are filling up. I won't go into a lot of detail about the Pacific Gyre, but if it hasn't been mentioned over the past few days, there's an area the size of Texas in the middle of the Pacific, which is full of plastic, and birds and fish and so forth are dying. We have a real reason to solve these problems. One of the key reasons I raise it is because, unlike most entrepreneurs, the guys who are working in the clean tech space are remarkably passionate. We talk about we passion instead of me passion. And you probably gather I'm a fairly crazy, passionate sort of person myself. One of the reasons that this has a very good chance of success is the kinds of people who are in clean technology entrepreneurship really care. This is not just about the money, although it's an important piece. People really care. Their level of persistence, their level of willingness to work through these kinds of issues are dramatically enhanced because they're working in this particular space. Okay, well that covers my point. Thank you very much. So how can cities or regions improve the level of entrepreneurship, and what's the kind of magic mix of things that make an environment very supportive to entrepreneurs. I was having a chat with one of the development officers in the city of San Jose about 6 months ago, and he said, pretty much every few months, someone walks in our door and says, we've got this brilliant idea. We want to create Silicon Valley in wherever the place is. And we've come here to find out how to do it. And it's a very common thing. You've heard there's a Silicon Glen, and there's a Silicon Alley, and there's all sorts of Silicon this and Silicon that. And part of the story is that there is a certain je ne sais quoi about Silicon Valley, which is very hard to replicate. So there isn't really a formula to it. But in terms of what cities can do, I'll mention some of the things that San Jose does. So San Jose is a first customer for many of these technologies. They are the people who buy, in many cases, Cleantech Open companies' developments, and they put, Armageddon Energy is one of the companies been through our process. Armageddon Energy has something called a solar clover, which is an easy-to-install solar panel. You can do it without the usual cost of installation. The city of San Jose doesn't particularly care about the cost of installation, but they've implemented them on some of their buildings as a means of providing both first customer revenue, because if you can sell the thing to somebody, you've got some credibility, and a place to pilot these things so that they can go and get results, get data, and so forth. Another thing that they do is that they have developed a very low regulation environment, and particularly in clean tech, if you come along looking for a permit, they will accelerate the permitting process. The federal government's done the same thing with patents now. So there is a green patent process, which means that you can dramatically speed the thing through in a way that you couldn't in other spaces. So governments can do things at a municipal level and a federal level. There's plenty more that we should be doing in the clean tech space particularly. But you're asking about entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship, basically the Entrepreneurship Index is one which reflects things like the speed with which you can set up a company, the speed with which you can fail, because you need to fail fast in startup world. Again, it may sound a little bit counterintuitive, but the guy or gal who starts a company and take years before the company can be allowed to fail, if you like, even though all the signs are that no one will ever buy this thing, are doing their owners and the economy and the market broadly a disservice. You need to have the ability to test the thing in the market, see if you can find a product market fit, in other words, a market that will buy this thing, and if they won't buy this thing, would they buy a variant of this thing? And if you've tested all the options, you need to move on to the next thing. So there are many environments in which it's really quite hard to get a company started. I'm told in Italy it can take months, maybe over a year sometimes, to get a company started. And then there's a huge amount of, there's a big issue if and when a company fails. In Germany, interestingly, the federal government will withdraw some privileges. You can't, I'm told, claim unemployment if you've had a company that fails owing money to the federal government, for instance, which is exactly the opposite of what we need. We need to have an environment where these companies can get going, test out their thing, fail, move on. The received wisdom is it takes probably 7 attempts for an entrepreneur to get to the stage where they've learned enough, been burnt enough to win. So that means on average, you need to have each entrepreneur failing 7 times before they'll take off. Silicon Valley, interestingly, is a very failure-tolerant place. Entrepreneurs here can fail and not have the stigma attached that is commonly the case in many other parts of the world, most other parts of the world.
Hi, I'm Yumin from a clean tech nonprofit called the Innovation Center for Energy and Transportation.
Great.
And wanted to ask you how hands-on you guys are after the initial training. 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road, what are your alumni going to be doing? Or do they get graduated into another association or?
Not hands-on enough is the answer. So we are thinly funded, and the Cleantech Open is very much focused on the early stage guy who comes to us. They need to have less than $1 million worth of capital from external sources. They need to be a very small company to go through our process. We offer things to the alumni companies, which include ability to come to our Investor Connect, which is a great big speed dating session with investors at least once a year. We put them back on stage again at our events. In fact, we had a whole series of our alumni presenting at the Cleantech Open conference last week. We give them access to our database of investors. We introduce them to corporations, but we need to do a lot more for those companies. We don't have the funding and the resources to do more than we do right now, is the answer.
Cambiar vidas,
Change lives,
change organizations,
change
दुनिया में बदलाव,
change the world.